I'll tell you what, maybe we will get rolling, and Dr. Hauser will join us in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone, and commissioners. Good to be seated with you in this room as well as in the prior room. It's good to remember that what we are trying to answer is the charge to determine if federal regulation and international standards adequately guard the health and well-being of participants in scientific studies supported by the federal government. But to pursue this, I remind the Commission and maybe to the news of many of you out there, we thought it was important to try to understand the existing landscape of scientific studies supported by the federal government, that piece we're supposed to comment on. And when the staff set about to do that, they requested data on research involving human subjects from 18 departments and agencies. And through that effort, learned not only about the landscape of federally supported human subjects research, but also about the variability among agency systems for tracking human subject research they support. In fact, I think we were all struck by how much the information is not available, or at least not available all in one place. Given the increasing call for, and appropriate call for, public access to information about human subjects research, we found the work very relevant to the overall discussion of transparency and accountability. So one of our subgroups that was assembled has been on transparency and accountability, and Christine Grady will talk us through some of the deliberations of that work leading up to possible recommendations.
Thank you, Jim. Am I close enough?
Yeah.
Okay. So first I want to recognize that I think everybody recognizes that there are substantial societal rewards, but also substantial societal investments in research. I was struck this morning, we heard $49 billion in 2010 from pharma, and NIH budget is $30 billion in 20, or close to it anyway, so that's a lot of money.
It's actually more.
So the public trusts all of this research to generate knowledge that's useful, and has a reason to expect some transparency and accountability in the pursuit, especially in the use of public resources. I think there are examples that we've seen and everybody's seen of risks associated with non-transparent conduct of research, or research that's not done in the limelight or the sunlight. There's also been a call over recent decades, really, for increased public access to information about publicly funded science, especially biomedical science. And the International Research Panel that we worked with emphasized the need for greater transparency and making information about medical research, especially greater than minimal risk research, available online. So I think it's worth our recognizing that there have been many important advances in the last decade or so in this regard. So clinicaltrials.gov includes basic information about clinical trials that are studying drugs and biologics and devices, and that's publicly accessible information that is included for both private and publicly funded research on drugs and devices under FDA jurisdiction. Many other countries have public registries for clinical trials: Brazil, India, Europe, others. The WHO has an international clinical trials registry platform that's voluntary. There are other sources of public information about federally funded research. There's USA Spending, which has information about federally funded grants and contracts. There's a relatively new health research web that was developed by the Council on Health Research for Development, or CORED, which has information not only about research studies, but also about IRBs and research ethics review committees and other sources of support for research ethics in places around the world. Recently, PubMed Central has become a publicly accessible database of publications that result from federally funded investigations. So there are a number of things that have happened, and some federal agencies have developed systems that are available to the public. So as Jim already mentioned, the Commission, in an effort to evaluate the adequacy of protections, wanted to try to get a picture of the landscape, the volume and the scope of research supported by the federal government. And to that end, asked each of the 18 federal agencies that are covered under the Common Rule to provide project-specific information regarding their human subjects research portfolio in 2010 and some trends prior to that, and asked for what was available from the agencies, including things like the title, the countries that the research was being conducted in, the number of participants, funding information, and things like that. I think it is worth noting that 100% of the agencies that were asked for data provided data to us about their portfolios, but as Jim already alluded to, the way they keep their information is very different from one agency to another. Their systems are very variable. Some are more complete than others in terms of what they include. And there are certain kinds of fields that are particularly hard to get from most agencies. With an incredible effort on the part of the staff, these data are still being analyzed and put together in a usable way. But a couple things that we do know already is that the U.S. government supports tens of thousands of human subjects research projects every year. And most of them are biomedical, but not all of them. And in fact, the range is quite interesting and something that there is not a lot of available information about for the public. The largest agency is HHS, but all of the other Common Rule agencies do some human subjects research. Putting all this together and trying to make sense out of the need for more publicly available information about research that's being done by the federal government, the Commission is coming to the conclusion, I think, that the expanded public access to certain information about federally supported research is both desirable and can be accomplished. But rather than suggesting the creation of a new central government-wide database, we're thinking about recommending that the existing systems at each agency be further developed and improved and include a minimal set of fields. And then each of those could then be available through a central web-based portal that's also developed by the government, so that the public would have access to information at each agency through this central web-based portal. So that's one thing that we're thinking about recommending. And the other is in recognizing that the need for information and data regarding how well the current standards and procedures in fact do protect human subjects, and recognizing the current limited data on effectiveness of protections that exist, the Commission is thinking of recommending federal government support for research and evaluation and other systematic approaches to evaluating the effectiveness of human subjects protections. So that's where we are.
And Lonnie and Nelson were part of that group.
Yes, Lonnie and Nelson. Thank you. And Michelle.
Yeah, Michelle. Anything either of you care to add?
Well, I think that in the group discussions, we came to the conclusion that, especially given the information that was provided by the landscape data, that there was a lot of information that was not available, which to me was very surprising, considering that a lot of this has to do with individuals and people. And having respect for those individuals and people, there was no kind of accountability with regards to some of the research being done. And I think in some instances, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nelson and Christine, there were some agencies that didn't actually have any data at all, or a place where they could go and pull this data easily for you, or for us to be able to actually look at. So, you know, when you talk about transparency, and I don't know how deep we as a commission want to go with regards to exposure of information, but you know, public access to me is very important for people to be able to go online and be able to access this data. So that was a suggestion with regards to the central web portal, where, you know, we understand it'd be very difficult for everybody to try to do something that conformed to one model. So this give us an ability to access their information. The thing we struggle with is how much information do we want? What kind of fields do we want on that, that should be reported? And that's one of the things we're grappling with now.
Nelson?
Yeah, so Dr. Medford this morning used an analogy of railroad gauges that are different, and between agencies, the railroad gauges are completely different. But so our deliberations reflected on that reality and attempted to find a feasible middle ground where transparency could be achieved, and achieved in relatively short order, but without putting into place a framework that would be very difficult to implement. So we wanted the good not to be the, we wanted the good to win and not be a situation where we achieved something that was perfect and would kill the good.
Sure. Now, it's interesting, Dr. Medford also mentioned, and I may have heard a different number, but estimates of the amount of, the relative size of the industrial research market relative to the federal, industrial research initiative funding levels. I've heard estimates sometimes twice what's going on in NIH. Do we feel that we can give the assurances to the President, or how will we feel that we can answer this charge if we don't also give assurances about having that sort of transparency in industrial research? And what are our assurances?
So, privately sponsored research that's biomedical anyway, and investigates drugs and devices and biologics, is already required to be part of clinicaltrials.gov. What is interesting about the data that we have been able to collect from federal agencies is that the federal government supports, and understandably looking at what the agencies are, human subjects research that goes well beyond biomedical. Lots of interesting other areas like education, for example. And so this recommendation would actually expand the amount of publicly available information about research in an extraordinary way, and that is beyond biomedical.
Nita?
So first, I think these recommendations are important and very good ones. And I think it's right that we don't want to force any particular model agency by agency because, as you put it, Nelson, it would make the good the enemy of the, or perfect the enemy of the, perfect the enemy of the good. But one thing,
We got it.
right? No, I always get idioms. I get every idiom wrong. But no, what I wanted to say is, while I agree with that we don't want to make it cumbersome, it does fit within the model of the federal government right now to try to streamline different web-based approaches across the government. So for example, USGov.search is trying to have a uniform search engine across all the different agencies. And there's a, across the federal government standardization process for web-based processes that's being developed right now and being encouraged. And so I don't think we should mandate it, but I do think in our ideal world, what would happen is that it would actually be a compatible system from agency to agency, and to the extent that agencies don't already have a system and that they are being encouraged to put into a system some sort of minimum criteria, it may make sense, just as the government has outsourced contractors to develop something like USA, gov.search, that they similarly do something to help agencies develop a system by which they can enter this information.
Raju? Oh, I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Right.
Yeah, I wanted to make just two. One, Christina, the recommendations look very good. I wanted to make this with regard to the goals of why people do research and what the ultimate outcomes are, whether academic research or public research, private research. And one is that they want to publish papers, right? Or they want to be able to do clinical trials for drug approval or some other nature for commercial interest. And certainly all of the medical journals now require that in order for your paper to be considered, that you need to have the data you have to register the trial in clinicaltrials.gov. Otherwise, they will not even consider the manuscripts. So that's an important driver for people to register. So as a result, I think many different studies most of the studies are indeed going to clinicaltrials.gov. The second one is actually an interesting question for us to the commission. We have argued at many times that having this information, I support the recommendation, but the question, that having this information is going to help us in trying to assess whether or not all of these are being ethically conducted or not. So one of the questions is that we have the data now. Do we have an answer to that question as to whether or not, with whatever data that we have available, whether we can address that issue?
Let me begin to answer that question, because I think it's one that we've all asked ourselves. Okay, so what would give us the basis for assuring the President that every human subject's research, every trial, whether it's clinical or otherwise, above a minimal risk standard, is being conducted ethically? If it were the case that just having the database would be the magic bullet, then we would have one recommendation here and run with it. And it's not. So Raju, his premise is absolutely right. Having this database will not in of itself guarantee that research is ethical. However, so it's certainly not sufficient, but is it necessary? I would say absolutely yes. The landscape project that our staff undertook has been going on for months now, and it took months and the goodwill of all the agencies to get the following information: study title, performance, country or countries, number of participants, and funding information. And the agencies, as they're now set up, their databases do not allow them to have that access. And until you get, so it's a necessary, not sufficient, until you get the ability to have that degree of transparency, you can't get the accountability that would enable not only our commission, but anybody who has a right to know, to basically say, okay, clinicaltrials.gov, is everybody actually registering who needs to register there? What other kinds of research is being done that poses more than minimal risks to people? So I think it's very important for us not only to make this recommendation, but also to be clear that this is just a first step. It's not the last step, and it would never be a sufficient step but it is a step that directly answers many people's legitimate concern about transparency.
Dan?
Yeah, I'd add to that it doesn't answer the questions, but in part it tells us where to look.
Yeah, that's...
we had, for instance, when we find out how much is done by the Department of Transportation or Education, and look that we haven't even been thinking about, I think, as a country, as potential places where human subjects research is being conducted under the aegis of the federal government. Second, it gives us an idea of the magnitude. So if we say it's 1%, it's 1% of what? We had no idea previously. And so I think those are important aspects of the empirical data.
Yeah, and when Christine says, thousands,
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands, what we now know, and we're still counting, is it's over 50,000 in last year. Over 50,000 studies, and that's in and of itself. And then we don't know the number of human subjects, but when we know that, we'll actually have some sense of how many people. So if nothing else, if you look at the reporting of adverse incidents, you'll have a sense of what percentage of it is. If it's a 100%, that's very different than it's 1% of the number of human beings. So this is a very important first step, and I think we were all somewhat surprised, and I say somewhat, different degrees depending on how close we were to how close we were to the operation of different agencies. So it is, I think, one of the aspects of the report that will come as a surprise to many people.
Christine, are there elements that the Fuller Commission can help the group with as you go forward? Lonnie mentioned you are wondering what you'll be making a recommendation what the minimal data set might be. You heard You heard Amy mention, the number of participants, also the adverse outcomes.
So it would be great if members of the commission have ideas or opinions about what the minimal data set should look like. At the moment, we're thinking about title, PI, funding source, and location, where the study's taking place. We could add number of participants. But that's something that has been particularly difficult, at least in the first round of collecting data. Very few agencies have that information.
And dollar amount.
And dollar amount.
And dollar amount.
Funding level.
Well, we could put it in here are, at minimum this, and this would be the idea, the ideal, what we think is a practical ideal, not one that's in our utopia, but we think, given the responsibility, the acknowledged responsibility of government to the public trust and to protecting human subjects, we think it would be good to know the number of human subjects and the amount.
One thing.
So
sorry.
Nita, then Lonnie, and is that okay?
So just one additional thing that I think would be really great to add to that list, something that has frustrated me as we've been collecting the data and unable to get, is the nature of the study. So, even if it's just a rough set of categories that says, here are the types of studies that might be undertaken, if we just have a title and we know how many participants there are, but we have no idea what the nature of the study is, it seems hard to provide true transparency, true oversight, or even to know which studies you want to scrutinize more in any more detail. So I think it's something harder for us to do retrospectively because it requires, data gathering on things that already happened. Prospectively, it seems like something that, should be easier to be able to capture.
Lonnie?
I was just going to say, I think it's important too that as a group that we consider when this reporting takes place. Does it take place at the beginning of the trial when it's first introduced, or the study, or is it somewhere midway through, or? Because one of the things we may want to consider is adverse impacts and what happens, if there's something that needs to be reported that has occurred. So I think it's important we may need to put in that recommendation when this reporting takes place.
Very important, I think, and so we'll see that it be done at the approval of the study, because we have adverse incident reporting, which comes retrospectively once there is an adverse. This should be a prospective reporting to know what's in process.
It's also more likely to be welcomed by the agencies if it's done. It's just the upfront, and it's not a continuing, particularly if we have in place mechanisms to do the other. Anita?
One of the reasons why I like this proposed recommendation is because we do have a national public policy of fair information practices and freedom of information access. We also have from President Obama announced January 2009 initiative towards more transparency and accountability in government. So I think the President will welcome this particular version of transparency and accountability. I do have, though, two concerns. One is a concern about who would have access to the data and whether our recommendation should proactively cite any costs or any downside to making this information available. And even if it's as limited as title of the research, location, funding source, and participation level, there may be sensitive issues around health privacy that we need to be concerned about. And I wonder whether we have any thoughts about those kinds of things, concerns about individual privacy, or concerns also about the question of who in the general public will have access. Because as you know, it's one thing for a database to be in some sense public, but if it's public but obscure because it's not available to the general public, it's a different kind of a story. So do we intend this to be a widely available public resource, or do we intend it to be information which the government can use in its own internal policy making and strategizing?
Just to respond to this, I think our idea was to have it widely publicly available, but I think Lonnie's question is very important. Depending on at what point in the trajectory the data is entered into this, I mean, presumably from the agency's perspective, it's already in there at the level that they make a funding decision. So that's the time that is most likely to be available in a broader way. Now, every time we think of adding something like the nature of the study or, other things, then the question of what are the costs and what are the pitfalls of doing it come up, and we should not only recognize those as we discuss it, but we should recognize that as we write it up as well. I don't know how we anticipate the costs, because each agency has a different system as it stands. Some are very much more complete than others, and so the agencies that have very little are going to have a big cost in ramping up even minimal data set.
And again, I didn't mean by cost simply monetary cost. I meant, for example, if some political groups in our society decide that they don't like the fact that X dollars are going to X kind of research, it might add to the sort of politicization of human subject research in ways which the scientific community would be very unhappy about, and some of us would be as well.
So what would you recommend in that regard? Don't list them?
Not at all. I'm in favor of the transparency and the accountability. I just think we should be very honest and open and proactive in identifying for the president the kinds of costs and benefits and issues of all sorts which will result from this greater degree of openness.
Dan, did you have your
Yeah.
hand up?
Can I get just a follow-up on this? There is already an example. There is a database at the NIH called CRISP, C-R-I-S-P,
Right.
that contains all the information about all of the grants that are made at the NIH. That includes the title, it includes the abstract which is prepared for lay people, and it is also possible to obtain the duration, the amount of money, and so on and so forth. And that has been in place for a long period of time. So there's a lot of experience in dealing with the kinds of issues both, Nita and Anita brought up, and I think that, we should examine as to whether that is a model or a model that could be used, and because we have experience with it, and that's publicly available.
Yeah, and it is a model. The problem is, at the current point, and this is given the monetary costs and the time and priorities, to advise the government to require every agency to have that exact same model where the other agencies have tiny budgets compared, research budgets compared to the NIH would be a mistake on our part. It would let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Whereas to recommend that they have a good system of prompt reporting, which if it's a very, which protects privacy of individuals because the names of subjects are not being identified.
Okay.
One other response on this topic for the kinds of data maybe that Nita was asking about. Once there is a database that's available, it doesn't preclude the possibility of doing sampling studies within those and then multiplying it by that, so that it's another advantage of having this database to begin with, because then you can do that kind of sampling.
Yes.
And then just a question for Christine. I know you've spoken to us about this before, but maybe for our mutual benefit and that of the public, to talk again about the distinction between adverse event reporting and this set of recommendations for a database, and why the subcommittee thinks they ought to be separate.
Okay. So earlier, we had a presentation that Barbara gave us on recommendations in the ANPRM, one of which is to develop a common database for adverse events and unanticipated problems in research, so that there aren't more than one reporting system for that when a researcher does his or her research. We envisioned that as distinct from this for several reasons. One is this is a way at the agency level to sort of make transparent what they're funding, not only in terms of dollars, but also types of research. But not, I like the idea of the sampling within, but not sort of results and not sort of what happens later. Whereas side effects and unanticipated problems are very important for understanding how we're protecting people and what the risks are of participating in research, and having them centralized in another way is very important, but it comes at a different time in the research process than this presumably would. And it's a reporting that's done by a different category of people. So the investigators report side effects and unanticipated problems, whereas in this case, we're asking the agencies to report. So they are really distinct kinds of reporting systems.
I failed to, thank you very much. I failed to ask the audience. We do have mechanisms by which you can submit questions or comments, and I guess I've got one coming up right now that we can look at, but please, please do. Dan, does that get to your, so essentially, Christine, what you're saying is it's important, but there are mechanisms in place, and there will be mechanisms in place, and data provided from a different source than what you're talking about up front. Russell Gedford, actually. Russell, are you?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Russ, Medford, not Gedford. I'm sorry, Russ. He has a suggestion to us. Consider applying a unified and effective model going forward. Funded programs must adhere to the database. I'm going to need you to stand up and explain that comment.
Why don't you stand up, Russell?
Russell, actually come up where where a microphone can help record you.
There's a microphone here for this very purpose.
Yeah.
You get to sit down.
Do I get the timer?
Yeah.
No, as a matter of fact.
I think you're wrestling with a very real problem. You have a legacy database of 50,000 trials.
But you have to talk.
Incompatible data systems to actually get the data. So my suggestion might be, and it might be more acceptable to the agencies, is build an effective and unified and bought into database approach on a prospective basis, saying now, from now on a given date, the data must be put in a certain way so that we have a unified database, and separate the legacy problem from the go-forward problem. So you'd have a two-step. So everything from now on or from some date will go into a universally accepted common database and meet all the requirements. And I think you need more than just the limited information that you can get, and then address the legacy issues separately.
I think it's probably the intent. Anita, I think you were suggesting.
So I think just as we've been discussing it, as if we want to preserve, allow agencies to preserve their existing databases. I do think we want to make clear when we develop our recommendations and develop the draft to say that, something like a unified model, if it were possible to develop, something like the, unified search system and all of the processes that the government is developing to try to unify systems across the government, it may be a lot less expensive, right? A single database that's developed and is given to each of the agencies might be the most efficient prospective system going forward.
Of course, our history on that's kind of discouraging, but I think...
Recent history is actually quite encouraging that. Recent history is, there's amazing efforts that have happened in the past couple of years to try across the federal government to improve the web-based systems and to try to unify the systems, particularly for this purpose, for transparency.
Well, I'm encouraged. I'd like to sort of take your theme and suggest as a friendly amendment that that the recommendations be that going forward, to take your point, whatever databases the agencies are using would include these data and we'd have them available. But then holding up that, obviously the ultimate would be this more unified piece. So if we could take prospective before unified, I think we might get more
Thank you for that helpful
result.
comment. That was.
Thanks, Ross. I'm sorry to mess up your...
But it's part of our agenda to uncover any existing misconduct that we might miss by simply recommending a forward-looking integrated data system.
So part of our agenda here is what Dan earlier said, which is if you would want to do a sampling of research, human subjects research that's out there. And unless you have a base on which to do that sampling, you can't really have a statistically significant sampling exercise. And so that's part of it. I think getting some way that data is collected at the agency level so that it can be made part of a unified system, whether it's a two-step or a one-step process. The dance itself doesn't make as much of a difference as the final outcome, which is that there is a publicly accessible database out there.
And what we would recommend get unified immediately is the minimum, a minimum data set.
Right.
And then the process can be, and I'm pleased, Nina, to hear your encouragement that we can expect to move on that. Not having other questions coming forward, and Lonnie and Nelson and Christine, are there other ways that the commission can help you as you go forward with this?
I think, given Raju's comment, maybe we do look at that as for some guidance on what Anita said, and Anita, maybe just even, given your background, call on you as well with regards to, that protection of information, because it is something to consider.
Good point. So we're in a rare situation of having completed a session ahead of schedule, so why don't we just move into the...
Right.